The Sound of Damian Wayne, written by Magnoliabee, read to you by Evie is Evil. Chapter 10, Interlude, the Book. Author's Notes. Trigger warning for the crassness that can generally be associated with John Constantine. Now, on to the fic. The bar stool was uncomfortable, but familiar as he sat, hunched over, loosely holding a beer in one hand. Constantine let out a row of deep coughs, careful not to slosh his drink with his sudden movements. He wiped a hand on his forehead, sweat pooling at his hairline. All he wanted was to lie down in bed and sleep for a year. He'd been convinced into helping raid some magic-obsessed, murder-happy man's home, even taking the trip to Boston, of all places, just to do so. Constantine was promised a few rewards of his own, mainly whatever items he'd wanted from the home. The whole thing hadn't gone very well, which he would prefer not to mull over, and so the only item he had on him was an old spellbook he'd managed to snag before an explosion ripped through the building, destroying everything else. He rubbed at his eyes, glancing at the satchel on his side where he'd placed the book. He wondered how much it might sell for. Probably a decent amount, as it seemed pretty old, but he had an inkling that it wasn't the sort of book one should just let out into the world. He glanced at the pages earlier, and found them to be written in old-fashioned Gaelic. If the few words he'd known had actually in fact been in the language, he'd rather figure out what the spells actually meant before selling the book. The bartender shot a pointed look at him as he shone a glass with a dish rag. It was late, and the bar would close in around half an hour. Constantine knew he should just look for a hotel room, or find a way back to the House of Mystery. But it was tempting to simply put his head down and fall asleep right there. Just as his eyes began to flutter shut, the bar's door behind him opened with a harsh slam. He looked over, annoyed, to be greeted with a most unexpected sight. A woman stood in the doorway, leaning on the frame with one arm. She seemed nearly as tired as he felt, her under eyes darkened against her pale skin. She looked frantically around the bar, before her gaze passed over Constantine, and her shoulders slumped slightly. He watched as she walked over to the bar, sliding into a seat one away from his own. She raised her hand to order a drink, sipping on it forgetfully as she swirled it around the glass. "Long night?" he asked, raising a disarming brow as she lifted her head. She seemed surprised he was even talking to her. And maybe she really was more tired than even himself from the way she stared blankly at him. Her gaze flashed down to his satchel, before a new harshness appeared in her eyes. "Could say that," she finally huffed, a small smile breaking onto her face. She bore a striking resemblance to the one actress from Luther, her hair a tad lighter and brows softer in shape. "You're not from around here, are you?" "I'm here for work. I live in Liverpool." He cracked a grin. "What gave me away? Am I too charming for Boston?" He leaned against the counter, turning his body toward her. "Just a bit. Accent didn't help either." She glanced at him before taking another sip, her lips curving just slightly around the rim of her glass. "You look like hell." "Not a fan, personally. Didn't like what they'd done with the place last time I visited." He coughed again, a gritty texture in his throat. She hummed, swirling her drink again. "Rough night?" she asked, parroting his earlier question. "Definitely up there, more fiery than usual." She laughed in an almost grim manner, a surprising sound, as if she didn't make it very often. It seemed to have shocked her, too, as her smile only grew. "I'm not much a fan of fire myself. You don't seem too bothered. Is this sort of thing usual for you?" "I'm full of surprises, love." She trailed a finger around the edge of her glass. The low hum of a jazzy tune played in the background, being broadcast by a glitchy speaker. "Do tell." He paused, looking at her with a new sort of attention. There was an edge in her voice that was hardly subtle. Her eyes held a ferocious sort of glint. Not desperate, but resolute. It was an intriguing kind of stare that led him astray many times, but it never became easier to deny. You make passes at strangers in dive bars often? Only when they're half as interesting as you. He snorted. I'm about a pack of cigarettes away from death. You sure I'm your type? Guess we'll see. She slid her glass away from her, finally finished. I've got a room, if you're curious. She paused, obviously waiting for him to say his name. Constantine, and you are? Melina, she said, and he ignored her stutter in favor of finishing off his drink. Well, Melina, lead the way. Her smile deepened as she got out of her chair. She had a tall and slender build, almost model-esque in some ways. Attractive, of course. And who was he to ignore a woman like herself? Perhaps his look had finally improved. Maybe she was the universe's idea of an apology. If so, she was a suspiciously good-looking one. Want a light? He asked, cigarette already in hand, as he lay back against the headboard. The sheets were scratchy against his chest. Melina had taken him to a nearby hotel that seemed to be one of the lower-end ones in the city. Not that he was complaining, of course. Free board and a beautiful woman were two things he would never take issue with. I'm all right, she replied, a nervous edge to her voice as she eyed his lighter. He wasn't sure if the hotel allowed smoking, but he found it hard for him to care much. Fire really isn't your thing, is it? He took a drag, watching her expression shift to something more rueful. He let out a bitter laugh. I can relate to that at least. We have a history, you could say. Constantine waited for her to continue, staring at her bare back. She had well-placed moles dotting across her skin, in an almost constellation-like arrangement. There was a fire, so my sister tried to play hero, and you can guess how that turned out. He grimaced. His hand hovered for a second, then landed between her shoulder blades, steady and useless. Like all things he offered. He was probably the last person anyone should ever have to comfort them, but she was out of luck if she wanted anyone else to do it. It had been his fault for her mood either way. He knew it would be a bad idea to ask, but he'd done it all the same, curiosity getting the better of him. A hand was the least he could give. She turned her head, a conflicted expression on her face as she looked at him. Sorry. No, I shouldn't have asked. That wasn't... It's fine, really. He coughed awkwardly, cigarette still in his mouth, and he took a drag as he waited for her to say something. She was staring off, eyes trained on a lampshade with too many frills for his liking. There was something unusual about her, a certain air to her that nearly suggested magical ability, if that were even possible. He narrowed his eyes as he tried to feel out what it was that he was sensing. Her fingers twitched by her side as he felt a slight twang in his soul. It was notable in the way it always was, an unpleasant scent that was almost coppery in the air, that he'd long associated with magic. What kind of business did you say you were here for? She asked suddenly. Constantine's hand dropping as she stood up, throwing her jacket over herself. Classified. Huh, how coy of you, she muttered, her tone flat. I was just curious. What about the bag? Or is that classified too? He weighed his options as he glanced toward his satchel, balanced carefully on the dark dresser. It was late, and he'd really rather be able to sleep than be thrown out of the room. It's just an old book I picked up at a garage sale. Can I see? I'm actually a bit of a collector myself. I mean, it's not much to look at. A bit musty if I'm being honest. She frowned slightly, as if she were actually getting upset at the notion she wouldn't be able to see the book for herself. He sighed, throwing his legs over the side of the bed and finally standing. There wasn't any real harm in letting her take a look. Perhaps she'd have a better idea of what the book may be than himself. He unclipped the worn metal clasp, carefully extracting the book. Melina watched him carefully, her eyes blown wide as she stared at the cover. I think the leather binding. It looks familiar. Would it be too much trouble for me to take a closer look?" "Go ahead," he replied as he handed her the book. Maybe she'd be interested enough to give an offer for it. He was a bit short of money at the moment. She took it gingerly from his hands, drifting a finger down the spine as she stared at the cover. He raised a brow as she opened the cover and let out a shaky breath. I can't tell you how long I've been looking for." Her voice cracked as she flipped through the pages, stopping to glance at certain passages. She looked about ready to marry the thing as she gushed over its contents. Incredible, really, truly spectacular. What sort of garage sale would sell a book of this kind?
"Bloody hell, I've seen people less moved at their mum's funeral,"
he huffed as he crossed his arms. "The owner was in a hurry to get rid of some things," Constantine answered slowly. He was curious why she was so emotional over an old tome. There had to be something more to it than her simply collecting old books. "Yes, sure, but do you understand what this is?" She raised her head, her eyes wide and bright. It took him aback a bit. She had seemed to have been carrying a heavy weight on her shoulders, even when he had first seen her, and yet, suddenly, she was exuberant in a most unexpected way.
"Not exactly. Care to explain?"
"Oh, please. We both know you're a bit more aware than that. You're a warlock, or something like that. I can't keep up with all the new terms, which used to be a blanket term, actually." He took a step back as she spoke. Obviously, whatever he had detected in the air had indeed been her, and she seemed to be much more aware than she'd led him to believe earlier. Her mask had fallen to reveal a face he wasn't sure he enjoyed much. An air of confidence had emerged that surely was new. "I think we have an equal amount of surprises, don't we, love?" he remarked, and she laughed, a smile playing on her lips. "Maybe. I'll tell you then. It's interesting." She leaned back a bit, grip still tight on the book. "About, maybe half a millennium ago, a druid was banished from his home. I can't remember why, so don't ask me. With a curse that began to seep away his form."
"He shagged someone's nan or something? Seems a bit tough."
She shot a glare at him as she continued. "He came all the way to America, hiding on a boat and settled deep in a forest. And that was his home for many years, content to spend the rest of his days until people began to move closer, chopping down trees and cutting away old brush to make way for homes and farms."
"Great. Let me guess. He throws a fit?"
"Do you always have to give your 2 cents?
"Yes. Why do you ask?"
"He grew upset as his land was destroyed in favor of stone dwellings, but he couldn't do anything with how weakened he'd become. One day, he met a young huntsman who strayed too far into his territory. He convinced the man to bring him an empty book, and wrote out as many spells and curses as he could."
"Convinced? What the hell does that mean?"
"As he succumbed to his curse, he had the man take the book. He prophesied that one day, exactly 500 years later, someone would be able to use it, that they'd bring the book back and use the magic, and return him to his glory. And he'd grant them their greatest wish in return, even things as impossible as resurrection." Constantine could only stare as she blabbered on, cheery at something that sounded increasingly concerning. He swore under his breath as she finished off. The last sentence was not a good one to hear. Every promised wish he'd ever seen a person desire had never turned out well for them. It didn't sound very worth pursuing either way. She'd seemed smarter than that, but that might have been the beer talking.
"And how do you know all this?"
he asked, annoyed that he had to now deal with whatever was unfolding. "Well, I've had an interest in Fae, long-standing as it were. They like to gossip, if you know whom to ask." A hardly convincing answer. He eyed the book still in her arms, and decided that indeed it would be better for it to stay in his care.
"And you just happened to hear that bloody bedtime story about my book?"
"Believe me or not, I don't care. It doesn't matter."
If you already know I'm a magic user, you'd understand why I want that book back. I can't have it falling into the wrong hands."
She frowned, her jaw tensed as she stared back, hands not leaving the book. "I was hoping you'd be more agreeable."
"You wouldn't be the first,"
he replied easily, but a flicker of unease burrowed into him that he chose to push to the side. It had been stupid of him to get involved with her. He needed to think of something, and figured a distraction would help him out.
"This druid, do you actually know where he's from?"
"Greyvale, or I guess you would call it Gotham nowadays." Again, she was saying stuff that suggested she was much older than she looked. He'd thought her to be in her early to mid-30s, but that couldn't be the case. She had an odd sort of accent that was muddled and impossible to place, what with her inconsistent speech patterns. Either way, she seemed unstable.
"Would this have anything to do with the whole ley line situation going on there?"
She nodded, a pleased expression appearing on her face. "The veil is getting thinner. On Sumahin, everything should be ready. Of course, some preparations are in order. Such a spell would require a lot of energy."
"And let me guess, you're the chosen one or something? Plan to raise some old bastard from the dead?"
He scoffed, taking another drag as he looked at her with disdain.
"You realise he's probably not going to just open a bloody bakery when he's corporeal again."
"He wants to go live in his forest again. That's it. I hardly see the harm in that."
"And did he tell you that himself, or was it the Fae talking?"
"He promised me," she snapped, her voice cracking, before shutting her mouth. He narrowed his eyes.
"So you're in contact?"
he prompted, burning his cigarette out on the dresser. It was old enough that a new scorch mark would easily blend into the ashen mosaic already imprinted onto it. "I never said that." He rolled his eyes, stretching out a crick in his neck as he eyed her. She looked about ready to bolt, and he couldn't let her do that with his book. Constantine would prefer to avoid any contact with Batman that involved an explanation of how he let a crazed wannabe sorceress loose to probably destroy Gotham.
"Give me that book, and I'll let you walk free, sweetheart."
He lied easily, knowing full well he'd tail her, after putting the book in a safe location.
"Let's be reasonable here."
Her fingers twitched once again on the book, her lip quivering, as if she was seriously considering giving up. He inched closer, only 4 feet away, before her eyes suddenly flashed white. Her expression morphed in an instant, becoming enraged and scrambling away, nearly falling over the bed as she backed into the corner.
"Leave,"
she growled, her voice raspy and worn. He swore under his breath, and was about to take another step forward, before a chill ran down his spine. Light beamed behind him, his shadow being cast across the room. He turned around, nearly tripping over his feet, as he was met with the sight of what seemed to be a white, glowing orb. The lights flickered around them, the smell of smoke dissipating, to be replaced with uncanny nothing.
"The hell is that thing?"
He leaned away from it, mentally cataloguing each part of its presence to seal it in memory. It simply floated in midair, not moving at all. It glowed brightly, yet, strangely, he felt no need to squint. "You really didn't have to come. I'm sorry," Melina cried out, and he whipped his head to her in disbelief.
"You're friends with the fucking translation sphere,"
he quipped, incredulous at the familiarity in her tone. The orb felt wrong in a way that was unlike any magic he'd ever come across. It made his skin crawl as it shimmered, eerie in its stillness. Power exuded from it, ancient and clearly not good. He guessed that it had something to do with the story Melina had spun earlier. The memory of the so-called druid was still fresh in his mind after all. It began to glow brighter than ever before, beams of light coming off of it in lazy waves.
"Sleep,"
it commanded in what sounded like a man's voice, and Constantine's legs suddenly lost their strength as he tumbled to the floor. His mind weighed on his skull, threatening to burst through it in its descent to the earth's very core. He tried to fight it for his consciousness, but it was a fruitless war. "Will he be all right?" Melina asked, distant and far away, a twinge of what couldn't be concern coating her voice. "He's not so bad, really."
"He will rise when he must."
As darkness began to seep into his vision, he wondered whether she would pay for the room or if he'd be shafted with the bill. "Hey, I missed you!" Damian's feet were still rooted in place, not daring to teeter closer to Dick. The man was like a black hole in some capacities, inescapable in the way Damian always found himself orbiting him. Dick tilted his head slightly, a bit like a dog might, raising a quizzical brow. His eyes narrowed slightly before he took another step forward. "Come on, can I at the very least get a hug?" he asked, a hint of tiredness hidden discreetly in his words. "I had to drive all the way down from Bloodhaven to get here. Traffic was terrible, and you know how I drive. Still, took even me almost 2 hours. "Fine." Damian made a face, as he spat out the word like it was a cherry pit. The pang to his back was just background noise, as Dick wrapped arms around him. And Damian hadn't realized how much he'd missed this. Missed them. So much so that he ignored the aches where Dick's arms dug into his bruises ever so slightly, letting himself, just for once, sink into the warmth that radiated off his brother. His arms were associated with safety, with success in missions where they'd taken down criminals with practiced ease. He smelled like laundry detergent, and his cologne, sandalwood, vanilla, and citrus all coming together in a redolent scent. Dick finally pulled back after a minute or so, no thanks to Damian's lame efforts of escape that were surely half-hearted at best. He frowned slightly as he stared, and Damian had to fight the urge to squirm under his sharp gaze. He began, before closing his mouth, as if considering his next words. "Never mind, sorry." Damian scowled, prompting a sudden laugh to escape from Dick. There was nothing comical occurring, and so he wondered what could possibly be so amusing to warrant such a reaction. Tim was not in the room, so no clowns were present to spark any bouts of laughter. "You ate dinner already, right? Tim said so anyway." Damian made a face as Dick spoke. I know. That was a dumb question. But, honestly, what's been happening with you? Tim mentioned some sort of art show that you had?" He nodded. "I wish I could have made it. You gotta show me the painting you made sometime. I'm sure it was amazing." Dick wiggled his brows. "Did you paint me? I hope you got my good side. The right side is always better. My right, that is." He rolled his eyes, crossing his arms in what he hoped wasn't obviously feigned annoyance. A hard balance to strike. "I'm joking. Kind of." Dick rolled his shoulders back, before stepping away and beckoning him to follow with a hand. "Everyone's down in the cave already. Let's go." Damian decided not to mention the fact that he had been banned from patrol in favor of falling in line. It was supposed to end that Saturday, so there was really no point either way. The stairs down to the cave were familiar, and yet still foreign to him as they descended. It really had been a while since he had entered into it, especially since the frequency of his visits had already diminished when he had been barred from going down during weekdays. It was distinctly cooler down below, and a low burble of conversation began to pick up in volume as they approached. There was still a slouch in Dick's posture that Damian observed as they walked, indicative of the lack of sleep he was surely dealing with. He was surprised he hadn't fallen asleep at the wheel when he had driven over. "Gotta be targeted. I mean, there's genuinely no way." Steph's voice cut through as they finally entered the main area of the cave. Indeed, it seemed all were gathered, barring Barbara. She was probably at her own base, or maybe taking a night off for once. Very unlikely, knowing her. Jason leaned against a counter, his arms crossed in discomfort that he was failing to conceal. Tim was nearer to where Bruce stood, his hand on his chin like he was lost in thought. Cass glanced over as they walked over to the main group, a smile playing on her face. "You're here. I'm glad," she said, walking up to Dick and enveloping him in a firm hug. She glanced over to Damian as she finally let go, her face suddenly falling as she stared at him. "You're in pain," Cass remarked. It was not a question. It was a fact she knew with certainty. Dick looked back at him, unmistakable worry mixed into his gaze. Damian opened his mouth, mind spinning through all the possible answers he could give before Bruce cut him off.
"He was injured last night during the kidnapping,"
he supplied, eyes darting down to Damian's arm.
"Do you need painkillers? It might help you sleep better."
He shook his head quickly. If he started taking them, he feared he'd grow dependent on the mild relief they would bring, and he didn't want anyone thinking he needed painkillers for a simple arm injury. Cass didn't look too convinced, but her attention turned back to where Damian's father stood as he cleared his throat.
"Dick, glad to see you here. We've been discussing what I believe Tim already mentioned to you over the phone."
"The whole blackout thing? It seems weird to me. The electrocutioner is still in Arkham, and these power outages don't seem exactly planned." Damian raised a brow at this, trying to catch up with what they were talking about. It was true he noticed the increased number of blackouts occurring. While Gotham's electrical system could hardly be considered robust, they didn't go out this often. He could recall many moments where the lights had flickered at school, and even at the gala a week earlier. Not to mention the billboard that literally blew up in front of Damian and I. Come on, there's no way it just randomly did that. Something's going on. Tim frowned, staring at the large screen at the front of the cave. It had a blown-up map of Gotham, marking the areas of blackouts. Red dots flashed on Gotham's grid like a spreading disease. These seem to be more concentrated in certain areas, but I can't figure out any pattern that would make sense. "There is a Batburger in all those places," Steph suggested, garnering a snicker from Cass. "Maybe they're just trying to target Jason." "Ha ha. There's a Batburger on every block of Gotham," Tim replied, as Jason shot a glare at Steph, who only smiled even wider. "Come on, guys, let's actually focus here. Any ideas?" Dick squinted at the screen. "Have we investigated the areas yet? Maybe we should check if the power lines have been messed with. Gotham Light and Power might have records of that anyway."
"Barbara is looking into that as we speak,"
Bruce answered.
"I think patrol is in order. Damian, I'm partnering you with Jason tomorrow night. You two will cover the Bowery and Park Row."
He perked up at this, not letting even the threat of having to be near Jason for an extended period of time ruin his mood. He nodded eagerly, trying to suppress his excitement at being allowed back on patrol.
"That reminds me,"
Jason piped up, finally pushing himself off the counter to stand at his full height.
"I got some intel about yesterday's situation."
"You mean the kidnapping thing?" Steph asked, resting an elbow on Cass like she was an armrest. She didn't seem to be too annoyed, more bemused by Steph's antics. Jason rolled his eyes.
"That. Seems like someone didn't like our kidnappers too much. They burned the whole lot down. And get this, not even a speck of lighter fluid or anything. It just burned that quickly on its own. By the time the firefighters came, there wasn't anything left."
What could even be the motive? Tim wondered aloud. Maybe one of the kidnappers had an enemy? But why go after a shoddy base instead of just going after the guy himself?
"Don't have a clue, but I'm gonna monitor that. Hopefully Gordon can get some information from the guys that are locked up."
Damian bit his lip, a pool of dread forming in his stomach. A fire with no fuel, an exploding billboard, erratic power outages, and a strange and ominous crow? He had an inkling of what this could mean, an answer he'd been avoiding since the beginning. But it made sense, though. It was the only thing that could reasonably explain it all. He just hoped it wasn't true. Melina. And that is the end of Chapter 10. Author's notes. Not certain if it was obvious, but the actress Constantine was referring to was Ruth Wilson. I found it funny comparing how Damian describes Melina versus how Constantine does. One is a bit less saccharine for sure. Kinda proud of the writing on this one. It's hard switching out of my Damian writing style, if you will. Hoping I wrote Constantine decently enough. I don't usually consume media with him, but his character is pretty intriguing to me. He and King Shark are peak writing, by the way. And a minor Doctor Who reference? How fun. I love having lore, if you will, specific to stories. So, sorry if there's too much exposition sometimes. I just like world building. I promise there won't be too many interludes at all. Not to yap too much, but just saying that unfortunately I have school and am unemployed. Surprising, I know. So while I'm committed to working on this fic, it is possible, not certain of course, that it may slow a bit, but we will see. Thank you for understanding anyway. Also, I have a Tumblr under Magnoliabee, so maybe I'll start posting on there and stuff. I'm bad at social media though, so bear with me. And reader's notes. This one was a fun chapter. I liked doing Constantine's voice, yay! I'm trying to think of things that I wanted to say, but I can't think of them now. But I'm kind of tired and my voice wasn't really working with me today. So, I think I'm going to keep this endnote pretty short. So, thank you guys for reading, and bye!